The Stuka appears first as a dark speck against the summer clouds, then resolves into its distinctive inverted gull wings. The pilot tips the nose forward, beginning his dive. At 3,000 meters, the siren begins to wail. That deliberate, psychologically calculated scream that has terrorized soldiers from Poland to France. The dive angle steepens to 70 degrees. The harbor facilities fill his bomb site. 2,000 meters, 1,500. The release point approaches. But something is wrong. The air around the aircraft begins to sparkle with tiny black bursts. Not the distant, ineffective explosions he's grown accustomed to. These are close, dangerously close. The shells are detonating in a precise corridor, exactly where his dive trajectory places him. 1,000 meters. The Stuka shudders. Metal tears. The canopy shatters. The aircraft tumbles, smoke streaming, the bomb falling uselessly into the harbor as the wreckage follows it down. The entire sequence, from dive initiation to destruction, has taken 17 seconds. The weapon that killed this aircraft has just fundamentally altered the mathematics of dive bombing. And most people have never heard of it. The Germans had spent years perfecting the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka specifically to solve one problem: how to deliver a bomb with absolute precision. Traditional level bombing, even from modest altitudes, was spectacularly inaccurate. Studies showed that fewer than 2% of bombs dropped from 3,000 meters landed within 100 meters of their target. When you were attempting to destroy a bridge, a ship, or a specific building, this level of accuracy was essentially useless. You needed dozens of sorties to guarantee a hit, consuming vast quantities of bombs, fuel, and aircrew time. The Stuka changed everything. By diving nearly vertically at the target, the pilot transformed his aircraft into a guided missile. The bomb release became almost point-blank, occurring at altitudes as low as 700 meters, whilst the aircraft was still pointed directly at the target. Against bridges, ships, fortifications, the Stuka achieved hit rates approaching 50% under ideal conditions. During the Polish campaign, Stukas had destroyed every bridge across the Vistula that the Wehrmacht needed demolished. In France, they had eliminated artillery positions, command bunkers, and communication centers with surgical precision. A single Stuka could achieve what would have required an entire squadron of conventional bombers. The psychological impact was equally devastating. That siren, the Jericho trompete, was mounted specifically to create terror. Wind-driven propellers on the landing gear fairings produced a characteristic wailing scream during the dive. Soldiers who'd experienced a Stuka attack described it as uniquely horrifying. The combination of the siren's psychological assault and the knowledge that the aircraft diving towards you was extraordinarily accurate created panic amongst even veteran troops. It worked. But dive bombing contained an inherent, unavoidable vulnerability. To achieve accuracy, the Stuka had to dive in a perfectly predictable trajectory. Every pilot followed the same procedure, drilled into them during training. Enter the dive at 3,000 meters. Roll inverted to begin the maneuver. Maintain 70 degrees descent angle. Release at 700 meters. Pull out below 400, accepting forces approaching 6 times gravity. This meant that for approximately 18 seconds, the aircraft flew a completely predictable path through three-dimensional space. If you could place anti-aircraft fire along that precise corridor, you didn't need to predict where the aircraft would be. You knew exactly where it would be. The problem was that in 1939, no anti-aircraft system in the world could do this effectively. British heavy anti-aircraft guns, the QF 3.7-inch weapons that formed the backbone of coastal defense, fired shells with time fuses. The procedure was cumbersome and slow. Gunners observed the target through optical rangefinders, estimated altitude and speed, calculated where the aircraft would be in the future, set the fuse to detonate at that precise time interval, loaded the shell, aimed, and fired. By the time the shell arrived, approximately 12 seconds later, the aircraft had often moved considerably from the predicted position. Against bombers flying straight and level at 7,000 meters, maintaining constant heading and speed, this achieved occasional results. Records suggest that conventional heavy anti-aircraft fire required approximately 3,000 shells to destroy a single aircraft. Against a Stuka, diving at nearly 500 kilometers per hour, through constantly changing altitudes, performing its attack in under 20 seconds, it was completely useless. The shells, set to detonate at specific altitudes, would explode harmlessly as the Stuka dove through those altitudes seconds before or after the detonation. The coordination required between observation, calculation, fuse setting, and firing made engaging diving aircraft with conventional shells essentially impossible. The solution emerged from a research facility that most people have never heard of, the Telecommunications Research Establishment at Worth-Matravers in Dorset. In early 1940, a small team working under Dr. W.A.S. Buteman developed something extraordinary. They called it a variable time fuse, though you might know it by its later American designation, the proximity fuse. The principle was revolutionary. Instead of requiring gunners to calculate when the shell should explode, the shell itself would detect when it was close enough to the target and detonate automatically. The mechanism fitted inside the standard 3-inch anti-aircraft shell. A miniature radio transmitter operating at approximately 200 megahertz broadcast a continuous signal forward from the shell nose. When this signal reflected back from a nearby aircraft with sufficient strength, an electronic circuit triggered detonation. The entire system, including 4 miniature vacuum tubes, a battery, capacitors, resistors, and the detonator mechanism, operated in the space of a shell nose cone 76 millimeters in diameter and weighing just under 300 grams. The elegance was in the simplicity. The transmitter didn't need to track the target or calculate trajectories. It simply detected a nearby metal object and exploded. Everything else, the aiming, the shell trajectory, the bringing together of weapon and target, remained the gunner's responsibility. But the final, critical timing decision now belonged to the shell itself. The technical challenges were formidable. The shell would experience acceleration forces of 15,000 times gravity when fired. This would destroy conventional vacuum tubes instantly, shattering the fragile internal structures and breaking the filament connections. The transmitter had to operate reliably at any altitude, from sea level to above 7,000 meters, in any weather conditions from driving rain to freezing cloud, while spinning at several hundred revolutions per second from the shell's rifling. It needed to distinguish aircraft from ground clutter, clouds, and the shell's own trajectory arc. The signal had to be powerful enough to detect an aircraft, but not so powerful that it drained the battery before the shell reached its target. And it needed to be manufacturable in quantity by workers without specialist electronics training at a cost the military could afford. A conventional proximity fuse would have been a laboratory curiosity. The team at Worth-Matravers needed something that could be produced by the thousands. They solved these problems through a series of brilliant innovations. The vacuum tubes were completely redesigned. Instead of the delicate structures used in radio receivers, these featured thickened tungsten filaments, shortened electrodes, and reinforced glass envelopes. The tubes were potted in shock-absorbing compound before installation. The transmitter operated at a frequency carefully chosen to penetrate clouds and rain, but reflect strongly from metal airframes. A mechanical safety device, essentially a weighted lever held by a shear wire, prevented premature detonation. The acceleration of firing broke the wire, but the lever remained in place until centrifugal force from the shell's spin moved it clear. Only then would the fuse arm. This prevented accidental detonation in the gun barrel or immediately after firing. The triggering threshold was calibrated through exhaustive testing so that the shell would detonate at optimal fragmentation distance, roughly 5 meters from the target. Closer, and the shell casing wouldn't have time to fragment effectively. Further, and the fragments would disperse too widely to guarantee damage. By March 1940, the first test firings took place at an experimental range in Wales. A 3-inch anti-aircraft gun firing standard proximity-fused shells engaged a radio-controlled target aircraft, a converted Tiger Moth flying at various altitudes and speeds. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. Where conventional time-fused shells achieved a hit probability of roughly 1% under ideal conditions, the proximity fuse achieved approximately 30%. Against diving aircraft, where the target's trajectory was predictable and the shell didn't need to chase a maneuvering target, the effectiveness increased further. Manufacturing began at a purpose-built facility in Middlesex, operated under extraordinary security. The building was deliberately disguised as a radio valve factory, producing what appeared to be standard electronics components. Workers assembled the fuses in separate stages, with no individual seeing the complete device or understanding its purpose. Production figures remain partially classified, but estimates suggest approximately 40,000 rounds were produced before the end of 1940, with production accelerating rapidly through 1941. The work was classified at the highest possible level. Even the gun crews who would fire the shells weren't told how they functioned. They were simply instructed that the new ammunition, identifiable by specific markings on the shell casing, required no fuse setting. Load the shell, aim at the target, fire. The shell would do the rest. The first operational deployment came in June 1940, as the Luftwaffe began systematic attacks on British shipping and coastal installations. Heavy anti-aircraft batteries at Portsmouth, Portland, Dover, and several other strategically vital locations received the new ammunitions alongside strict instructions about security. If any DU'd rounds fell into the sea or on land, recovery teams were to locate and retrieve them immediately. Germany could not be allowed to examine an intact proximity fuse. The technological advantage relied entirely on secrecy. If the Germans understood how the fuses worked, they might develop countermeasures or copy the technology themselves. Gun crews at these sites underwent additional security briefings but received no technical information. They were told only that the new shells, marked with distinctive red bands around the casing, required different handling procedures. No fuse setting was necessary. Simply load, aim, and fire. The gunners, accustomed to the frustrating ineffectiveness of time-fused shells and the constant pressure to achieve results against fast-moving targets, were initially skeptical. They had been promised improved ammunition before. Their skepticism lasted until the first engagement. The transformation in effectiveness was immediate and dramatic. At Dover, where Stuka attacks on the harbor and channel convoys had become almost routine, the first proximity-fused engagement occurred on July 12, 1940. 3 Stukas dove on a coastal convoy. The lead aircraft began its dive from 3,000 meters. The battery commander, following new standing orders, waited until the Stuka committed to its dive, then ordered engagement. The guns fired. The shells rose to meet the diving aircraft, their proximity fuses armed and transmitting. At approximately 1,500 meters altitude, the lead Stuka entered the fragmentation zone. 3 shells detonated in rapid succession. Fragments tore through the aircraft's wing root and fuselage. The Stuka rolled, trailing smoke, and crashed into the channel. The remaining 2 aircraft aborted their attacks and fled. The entire engagement had taken less than 30 seconds. The battery had fired 18 rounds and achieved 1 confirmed destruction and 2 attack abortions. By the standards of conventional anti-aircraft fire, this was extraordinary. Stukas that had previously attacked the harbor facilities with near impunity suddenly found themselves flying through precision barrages. The shells detonated with uncanny accuracy, seemingly able to sense the aircraft and explode at exactly the right moment. German pilots, trained to evaluate anti-aircraft fire based on visible shell bursts and adjust their tactics accordingly, couldn't understand what had changed. The shells appeared to be seeking them. Several aircraft were destroyed in their dive runs, exploding or breaking apart before they could release their bombs. Others were damaged severely enough that they crashed attempting to return to France or were forced to ditch in the Channel. Perhaps most significantly, pilots began aborting their dive attacks entirely. The psychological calculus had shifted. A 70-degree dive that positioned you perfectly for your target now positioned you perfectly for the British shells. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. There's far more to this story, and your support means we can keep bringing these forgotten histories to light. German intelligence was baffled. Interrogation reports from captured British gunners revealed nothing. The men genuinely didn't know how the shells worked. They only knew the new ammunition was remarkably effective. Luftwaffe intelligence officers examined the situation tactically. Perhaps the British had simply deployed more guns. Perhaps they developed better predictive techniques. The possibility that the shells themselves contained active guidance systems seemed too technologically advanced to be credible. British radar was known, but miniaturizing such technology into an artillery shell appeared impossible. The Germans had attempted similar research and concluded it couldn't be done with existing vacuum tube technology. So the attacks continued and the casualties mounted. The Americans were simultaneously developing their own proximity fuse through a parallel research program. When technical information was shared between the Allies in late 1940, both nations were astonished to discover the other had independently solved the same problem using remarkably similar approaches. The American VT fuse, developed at the Naval Research Laboratory and later manufactured in enormous quantities, would eventually become famous for its use in the Pacific theater. But the British version was operational first, and it was the British version that first proved the concept against the weapon it was specifically designed to counter, the diving bomber. German attempts at equivalent technology reveal how significant the British achievement was. The Luftwaffe research establishment at Rechlin had investigated proximity fusing as early as 1936. They concluded that vacuum tubes could never survive the firing shock and abandoned the project. Later efforts focused on acoustic and photoelectric fusing systems, neither of which achieved operational effectiveness. The best German anti-aircraft shells throughout the war remained time-fused, requiring manual calculation and setting. Against high-altitude level bombers, skilled German gun crews achieved reasonable results. Against diving aircraft performing evasive maneuvers, they were nearly helpless. The British had solved a problem the Germans didn't believe could be solved. By late 1940, the impact on Luftwaffe dive bomber operations was measurable. Mission reports from Stuka units operating against British targets showed increasing losses and, more tellingly, increasing numbers of aborted attacks. The Stuka's extraordinary effectiveness during the Continental campaigns had relied on air superiority and light anti-aircraft opposition. Against determined fighter defense and accurate anti-aircraft fire, the aircraft's vulnerabilities became critical. It was slow. Maximum speed was barely 390 kilometers per hour. It was vulnerable. The dive bombing technique required the aircraft to fly straight and predictable. And now, with proximity-fused shells, that predictability was lethal. The strategic impact extended beyond simple aircraft attrition. Dive bombers represented a crucial capability for the Luftwaffe, particularly against naval targets. The accuracy advantage meant that a single Stuka stood a reasonable chance of hitting a ship, something that required dozens of level bombers to achieve equivalent probability. As Stuka losses increased and effectiveness decreased, German tactical options narrowed. The planned invasion of Britain relied heavily on Luftwaffe ability to suppress the Royal Navy. Dive bombers were central to that plan. By autumn 1940, the concentration of proximity-fused anti-aircraft defenses around British ports and harbors had made dive bombing operations increasingly costly. This didn't stop the invasion on its own, but it was part of the accumulated tactical failures that made the operation impossible. The proximity fuse influenced post-war weapons development profoundly. Every modern anti-aircraft missile system uses some form of proximity detonation. The principle of allowing the weapon to make final timing decisions rather than requiring the operator to calculate everything in advance became fundamental to guided weapons design. The specific challenge of hitting diving aircraft contributed to the development of radar-guided guns and eventually surface-to-air missiles. The dive bomber, as a weapons system, became obsolete not because aircraft design changed, but because defensive systems evolved to exploit its inherent tactical weakness. Modern ground attack aircraft can release precision-guided weapons from level flight at safe altitudes, making the vulnerable diving attack unnecessary. That evolution began with a British proximity fuse and the recognition that a predictable trajectory, no matter how effective for the attacker, provides an equal advantage to the defender. Surviving examples of the early British proximity fuses are rare. Most were expended during the war, and the components were classified technology for years afterwards. The Imperial War Museum holds several sectioned examples, where you can see the miniature transmitter components and the mechanical safety mechanism. The Science Museum's collections include the development prototypes from Worth Matravers. Looking at these devices now, it's difficult to appreciate how revolutionary they were. A proximity fuse looks like a slightly more complicated shell nose. You can't see the electronics. You can't see the transmitter broadcasting its signal. You can't watch it detect the reflection and trigger detonation. But in 1940, these innocuous-looking devices fundamentally altered aerial warfare. The Stuka that dove towards Portland Harbor on that August morning represented the culmination of years of tactical development. The pilot was trained, experienced, confident. His aircraft had destroyed targets across Europe with near impunity. The dive bombing technique had been perfected through hundreds of missions. Everything about the attack followed established, proven procedures. And that was precisely the problem. The British had created a weapon that turned the Stuka's greatest strength, its predictable accuracy, into its fatal vulnerability. The shells rising to meet that aircraft contained technology the German pilot couldn't have imagined, wouldn't have believed possible if you described it to him. He simply knew that the sky around him was suddenly filled with explosions that seemed impossibly, uncannily accurate. Then metal tore through his engine. Fire erupted. The ground rushed up. In 17 seconds, the most feared ground attack aircraft of the war had been transformed into falling wreckage. The forgotten British weapon that destroyed German dive bombers before they could drop wasn't a new aircraft. It wasn't a different gun. It was a shell that could sense its target and choose its own moment to strike. Simple in principle, extraordinarily difficult in execution, operationally decisive in application, and almost entirely unknown today. Yet it was this innovation, born in a research facility in Dorset, perfected in secret factories in Middlesex, deployed to batteries along the British coast, that first demonstrated you could defeat the dive bomber. You simply had to hit it in the 18 seconds when its attack made it predictable. The proximity fuse made those 18 seconds lethal. That changed everything. If you liked my video, please share your opinion in the comments box and subscribe to the channel. Also, turn on the bell icon so that the latest videos like this keep reaching you. See you in the next video. Take care and goodbye.